Mr. Mayor, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the university, welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the Baroness Morris of Bolton, Doctor of Laws, Doctor of Philosophy of this university. Lady Morris is the chairman of the Center for Islamic Finance and the first Chancellor in the history of this university. Lady Morris, the floor is yours.
Vice-Chancellor, Mr. Mayor, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted, as Aris was, to welcome you here for the second Centre for Islamic Finance lecture. The centre was founded in 2012 by Professor Mohammed Abdul Haq, who is the university's Professor of Banking and an internationally renowned expert on Islamic finance and a former advisor to the government. The topic for tonight's lecture is Britain and the EU, the future of a troubled relationship. You might wonder where that fits into Islamic finance. Where it does fit is with the Centre's philosophy that Islamic finance should be mainstream, that what is of interest to students and practitioners in geopolitics and economics, in conventional finance, is of equal importance to Islamic finance. We are delighted to welcome to Bolton the Right Honourable Lord Lamont of Lerwick, or Norman Lamont as he is more widely known, to deliver this year's lecture. We are particularly proud as Norman is a director of the Centre for Islamic Finance, which is very much a feather in the cap for the University of Bolton. Lord Lamont is a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, having served for a total of 14 years in successive governments under Margaret Thatcher and John Major. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer at a particularly difficult time for Britain's economy, including Britain's exit from the ERM, although it is now looked back upon as a golden moment. Lord Lamont, well, certainly in my view anyway, Lord Lamont was described by Margaret Thatcher's former advisor, Sir Alan Walters, as, quote, not only the most effective, but the bravest Chancellor since the war. And many economists and commentators have attributed the economic stability and growth enjoyed in Britain in the 1990s and thereafter to the policies that he introduced. Vice-Chancellor, Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Lord Lamont of Lerwick.
Vice-Chancellor, Mr. Mayor, Lady Morris, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Trish, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you very much for asking me here to Bolton, the home of one of my childhood heroes, Nat Lofthouse. I'm delighted to be here at the University of Bolton. I've heard great things about how the university is expanding, moving forward by leaps and bounds, and intimately connected with the regeneration of the town. I am also absolutely delighted to be a director of the School of Islamic Finance, and I'm very grateful to my two friends, Mohammed Abdul Haq and also Baroness Morris, for involving me in that. It is something I take very seriously, something I'm actually interested in, though not well informed on. They're an important distinction. I was asked if I would speak about Britain and Europe, a vexed subject, one that has caused great division in politics. I think it's a very dangerous subject for a politician to talk about. For those of you who know me, I am perhaps known as something of a Eurosceptic. on the European Union. But I made my maiden speech. Maiden speech is one's first speech in the House of Commons. A maiden speech was once described by a poet as a speech which all men praise but none remember. But I made my first ever speech in the House of Commons advocating that Britain join the European Union. The only time that I've ever spoken at a rally in Trafalgar Square, it was also in favour of our joining the European Union. But of course, in those days, this was in the 1970s, British minds were concentrated very much on the economic aspects of joining Europe. Very few people talked about the political dimensions of what was then called the common market. We were vaguely aware that the founders of Europe, Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, talked all the time about political union. And some people wondered, does this mean we're going towards the United States of Europe? What does this phrase in the Treaty of Rome, the ever closer union of European peoples, mean? But whenever one asked that question, one was told, don't worry too much about that. That's all rhetoric. Nobody really means it. And then along in 1973 came what was called the Werner Plan, which put forward the idea that there should be a single currency for the whole of Europe. That actually, at that time, found very little favour, and it fell away very quickly without anybody really pursuing it very far. At that time, the 1970s, the emphasis in the arguments on Europe was very much just on the opportunity for Britain of having this very large market and the benefits that that would bring to British industry and British exporters. The fault line, which opened up over European British politics, really appeared in the mid-1980s under a measure that was ironically introduced by Margaret Thatcher, the Single European Act. The significance of the Single European Act was that it expanded the areas where qualified majority voting applied in determining policy within the European Union. Majority voting, rather than had hitherto been the case, each country having its own veto to protect its own national interest. Prior to the Single European Act, unanimity was required for all proposals for legislation in the European Union. Mrs. Thatcher was keen on this because she believed this was removing the barriers to trade, creating a large market, making it free up. Later on, she insisted that she was misled about the nature of the Single European Act. And many people, including myself, thought that the purpose of moving to qualified majority voting on certain areas was to harmonize standards in industries, things like the sorts of fittings you needed on electric plugs, or there was even a proposal at one stage to harmonize the size of wine glasses. You may not believe that, but that was actually defeated despite qualified majority voting simply because of derision in the House of Commons. Well, maybe Mrs. Thatcher was misled about the nature of the Single European Act, or perhaps, as is also possible, the Single European Act was misused. Certainly, it became a Trojan horse whereby measures were forced through against the interests of some countries on a basis of majority voting. And there were some extremely damaging decisions made about fishing. In the end, the common fisheries policy in the European Union really wiped out the fishing industry of the UK. But it was this act, the Single European Act, that really caused the arguments about our membership of the European Union to resurface. Fast forward a few years, I think the next development were the proposals for a single currency, a rebirth of the Werner Plan. And this came about via a study under Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, of the central bankers of the European Union, who recommended a single European currency with a single central bank, very much modelled on the lines of the German central bank, the Bundesbank. Despite Mrs. Thatcher's very strong objections, this proposal went ahead. Mrs. Thatcher ceased to be Prime Minister, and very unexpectedly, I found myself in the position of being the negotiator at the Maastricht Treaty. When I say the negotiator at the Maastricht Treaty, the negotiations lasted a whole year. We used to meet once a month, and I was negotiating Britain's opt-out, Britain's non-participation in the euro, albeit with a proviso that if we wanted to join at a later stage, we might be able to. My own position was one of total opposition to the euro. I always made it clear to John Major if we ever wanted to join it, I would certainly not remain in the Treasury for 5 seconds. His position was, well, you can't forecast the future and perhaps we should keep our options open. But I have to say, it was really the dreariest year of my life, going to these meetings once a month, where, of course, Britain was not the main point. I was there to make sure that we were exempt from all the provisions of the treaty. The focus was on what sort of currency would it be, what is the relationship with the central bank, and of course we tried to contribute to the discussion in a way that was sensible and constructive, as well as safeguarding our own interests. But I put forward at the time, it's not my brilliance or wisdom, but it was being widely said, one, without real mobility of labour in Europe, without a common finance ministry, without a harmonisation of taxes, I couldn't see how this thing could work, and I couldn't see how it would, other than generate great pools of unemployment in certain of the weaker economies. As I say, it was something of a dialogue of the deaf. They say that in history, nothing ever happens in the right place at the right time. But fortunately, we have historians who put that right. I certainly think to claim any foresight is wrong. Most things don't happen as one predicts. But I have to say that what subsequently happened with the euro and happened in southern Spain, in southern Europe, in Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, these huge pools of unemployment was very much what one had expected and what many people had forecast. And many people indeed had forecast that we would see social unrest because the rigours, the straitjacket of the euro, trying, if Aris will forgive me, to make Greeks into Germans, this was never going to work. And was always going to cause great strains. And I'm not at all surprised, and I think many people are not surprised, I claim no wisdom for myself, that we have had these tensions between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, when the policies have been largely those of the Bundesbank, largely those of German austerity. The only thing that has surprised me is that it has taken so long for the protests in Europe to erupt in southern Europe. After all, when you think that unemployment in Europe is 11.5%, that is an average across the whole Eurozone, twice that in Britain, but Germany has low unemployment, so the rate of unemployment in many countries, particularly of young people, is astronomically high. In Greece, GDP has fallen by 25% and unemployment is approaching 30%. My surprise was that a party like Syriza and the protests on the street didn't happen a lot earlier. I would have thought there would have been a reaction much earlier, and frankly I've been very puzzled that this has not happened. But when I look back on the negotiations, I think I understand a little why this has been received so calmly and why there's been the determination to press on with the Euro project, which I would regard as a historic mistake. But I think I begin to understand it. One has to remember that the key to the Euro is the relationship between France and Germany. And the Euro was created really after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And the reunification of Germany put fears in President Mitterrand's mind. And really the Euro, the single currency, was the result of an agreement between Mitterrand and Kohl designed to bind the two countries together in order to ensure that there'd never again be war between France and Germany. And those fears were somewhat kindled by the reunification of Germany. Remember, France is a country that had fought no fewer than 3 wars against Germany in 100 years. And so the motive behind the Euro was an honourable one. It was peace in Europe, never again to have the cataclysm of 3 wars. I myself regard the logic as faulty, but the motive cannot be faulted. To put it in another way, there was a Spanish economist called Pedro Schwartz, a Spaniard with a German name, who once rather frivolously, but I'm making a serious point, remarked that he thought the Euro owed more to Freud than it did to any economic theory. And he said that the reason the Euro existed was because France was afraid of Germany. Secondly, Germany was afraid of Germany. Thirdly, the Italians didn't trust themselves. The Spaniards and the Portuguese wanted to be French. The Greeks wanted to be Turks. The Irish wanted to be rid of the British. And the Dutch, the Danish, and the Luxembourgers wanted a place at the top table. The only thing he didn't add was that Britain wanted nothing to do with it because it had won the war all on its own. Now, that may seem a very frivolous remark, but I think it embodies the truth that different histories and different national psychologies of why the Euro came into existence. And for countries like Spain or Portugal or Greece, the Euro, and indeed membership of the European Union, but the Euro also signified modernity, putting the past behind them, forgetting the fascist dictatorship, the junta in Greece and the fascist dictatorships in Spain and Portugal. And it was the underpinning of democracy. That, I think, is why, despite all the hardship that the Euro has provided and produced, people in Greece, people in Spain, people in Portugal have been, a majority of them, according to polls, saying they want to remain within the Euro because this is a political idea rather than an economic idea, and I would say an idea that actually is practical or makes sense. But the ambition for Europe from all those countries and was of an entirely different nature from the motives that led Britain to join the European Union. There was another problem with the Euro that was highlighted by a professor at Harvard called Martin Feldstein, who was a Nobel Prize winner, where he said the flaw in the Euro was that different countries would have different expectations out of common institutions. And that is, I think, exactly what has happened. Some countries wanted low interest rates. Some countries at times needed high interest rates. What they always got was something in between, a compromise. And now you see the division between the northern countries, Finland, Holland, Germany, Luxembourg, saying Greece must stick to austerity. Greece must continue with this. We're and our citizens are not going to pay the bills for their overspending. And then you have a completely different attitude in Southern Europe, where they are calling for more debt relief and more understanding of their position. Just one footnote. Trish referred to the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, and the crisis in 1992 over that, with which my name will be everlastingly associated. It all turned out for the best. But there was one consequence of the ERM and Britain's short-lived membership of it that people don't often note. It solidified British opposition to the euro, because people thought that the ERM, which was just the linking of our currency to other currencies in Europe, but it could be reversed at any time, as indeed it was. It wasn't the creation of a single irrevocable currency, but people saw it as a dry run for the euro, and because it too was associated, perhaps not correctly in people's minds, with rising unemployment and recession, it had the political consequence that it made Britons much more sceptical about the euro and more determined not to join it. And of course, Britain has had the freedom to have a floating exchange rate, to have its own monetary policy, and it's also had the ability to indulge in quantitative easing, the form of purchases of assets by central banks to inject liquidity into the banking system and into economies, which has been pursued both in the United States and in Britain. This week we had an interesting development when Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, announced that quantitative easing was going to be introduced into the Eurozone area. This means that the central bank is entitled to buy the bonds issued by governments in the market, injects liquidity, injects money into banks and into the economy in order to get the economy moving. And this is a policy, as I say, that has been pursued first in Britain, but before that in the United States. When Mr. Draghi came to make his announcement, which was spectacular in its scale, he had to announce that actually the European Central Bank itself would not be buying most of the bonds. It was the national banks of the different countries that would be buying the banks. And this, I think, shows a fundamental distrust by Germany of the whole concept of the euro. What they were saying is, we don't want the European Central Bank, in which we Germans are shareholders, to be buying Italian bonds, Greek bonds, or French bonds, because we might have to pay part of the loss, if there is a loss. Instead, we Germans will buy German bonds. And this, I think, very much undermines the credibility of the monetary union. What sort of monetary union is it that doesn't use its central bank actually to buy its own securities if it wants to pursue a policy of quantitative easing? The direction of Europe became, after Maastricht, became clearer with the Lisbon and Nice treaties. Europe at that point moved up a gear. More and more things became integrated, or more and more things came potentially under the jurisdiction of Brussels. Some aspects of justice and home affairs, the European arrest warrant, Europol. In the financial services area, more and more institutions, whether they were banks, security dealers, insurance companies, found that their regulation didn't come from Whitehall or Westminster or the British government, but came from Brussels. In foreign affairs, there was more and more of a push towards having a common European policy. The only trouble was the individual countries could never agree on what the foreign policy ought to be. Just look at any controversial question of international relations in recent years. Syria, no agreement. Iraq, no agreement. French opposition, probably right. The Falklands, no agreement. Kosovo, no agreement. Libya, no agreement. Attitude towards Russia, no agreement. It is extraordinary. And yet, despite this, the European Union has carried on opening hundreds of so-called embassies throughout the world. They now have more embassies than Britain does, and some of them have much larger staffs, paid larger salaries. In fact, Britain's losing diplomats moving into the European External Action Service. So what we were seeing was the drive for more Europe going on and on at the time when Europe's economic performance was sliding down and becoming more and more difficult. Britain's relationship with Europe, I think, has been fractious since the very beginning. We joined late. Other European countries are annoyed and irritated by the fact that we are primarily, or appear primarily, interested in the economic aspects of Europe, in the single market. We are less keen on European integration for the sake of integration. Many people in Britain harbour the view that they were misled. They thought they were joining a common market. It has turned out to be something rather different. Of course, polls show a rising dissatisfaction of throughout Europe with the EU. The rise of UKIP in this country is not a phenomenon on its own. It's mirrored by the rise of protest parties throughout Europe, Syriza in Crimea, Podemos in Spain, and most extraordinary of all, recently, Neue Deutschland in Germany. Much of this, of course, has been fueled by the failure of the euro. But to many British people, this has just confirmed their scepticism about Europe. Scepticism about Europe has persisted in Britain. It exists for two reasons. One, history. I explained with that remark of Pedro Schwartz the impact of war, invasion. Britain has not been invaded in the same way. And I think Britain doesn't feel the same motive as France and Germany to unite. But secondly, I think it's also because Britain has a much more robust attachment to parliamentary democracy, to the idea that ministers are accountable for what they do and answerable to the public for decisions that have been made. Britain has several opt-outs from different aspects of European treaties. It's not just the euro, which we are not participating in. There are some aspects of justice and home affairs that we don't participate in. The social chapter, there were elements we had an opt-out from. The Schengen area for travel throughout Europe without travel documents, we have opted out of as well. At times, it's appeared as though Britain was leaving the European Union by stages, or perhaps the European Union was leaving Britain by stages. But in response to the rising dissatisfaction in Britain, David Cameron made his pledge to renegotiate the terms of membership for Britain of the European Union and to hold a referendum on whether Britain should stay in the European Union on the revised terms. He made it clear himself that he thought it was highly probable he would wish to stay in the European Union anyway, a decision that led to some criticism. But this is undoubtedly a historic, far-reaching and dramatic promise. Some people regard it cynically. They say the renegotiation will be largely cosmetic. There won't be really a repatriation of significant powers to Britain. But even those people, by and large, have welcomed his decision because it will give the British people an opportunity to vote again on whether we really do want to be in the European Union or not. So even those who disagree with the whole strategy of renegotiation will be able to vote. And I think it must be right that we have this vote because we haven't had one since the previous referendum to confirm our membership long ago in the 1970s under Harold Wilson. There would also have had to be a renegotiation to some extent, whether David Cameron wanted one or not, for this reason. In order to shore up the euro with all its problems, the Eurozone is taking more and more measures to integrate, measures largely to do with financial institutions and monetary policy and economic policy, but they're making lots and lots of decisions which are irrelevant to Britain, but are relevant to the euro. And we have to be very clear that those measures and decisions do not apply to Britain and have unintended effects and unintended consequences on us. And at the moment, the Eurozone just about constitutes a majority in voting terms within the European Union. So we have to safeguard our issues, safeguard our interests, because there might be issues and decisions which would affect us, which really are not intended to affect us, but could have very serious consequences for us. The Prime Minister has been rather coy about what areas of European Union competence he would wish to renegotiate, and one can only speculate. They might be some aspects of justice and home affairs, the justiciable nature of the European arrest warrant under the European Court of Justice. They might be some aspects of immigration. They might be also the declaration of the European Union in favour of ever closer union. Cameron has said that he would like to get that removed so that we don't have this endless pressure towards integration, regardless of whether it's directed at a problem, whether it is actually needed or not. And then lastly, another area where I personally hope there would be attention in the renegotiation is that of parliamentary accountability. I think decisions in Europe got so far removed and so far beyond the power of national parliaments that it is necessary to have some sort of mechanism whereby national parliaments can have a say and can have the power to delay, postpone, or in some cases veto veto European proposals. People live their lives in their imagination as citizens of individual countries. They don't see themselves primarily or exclusively as European. There is a European identity, but I think it is a relatively shallow one. Maybe in time it will become a stronger one, but at the moment it is not the primary identity that people have. People vote in elections and they expect governments to pass laws, enact measures, and if they are unable to do so, to explain why not, and to be held to account in general elections. Of course, there is the European Parliament, but the European Parliament covers 28 countries. Britain has only 7% of the votes in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament represents all sorts of divergent interests. You know, what does a citizen of Shetland and Sicily and Piraeus have in common? Speaking as a person who was born in Shetland, I would say not a huge amount. To return to the renegotiations, these have to be completed by 2017. It's an extremely tight timetable. Some people would say it is an impractical timetable. Well, time will indeed tell, but there will then, in theory, be a referendum of the British people on the package of renegotiation and whether we should stay in. This will be a major, major political event. I hope that it will arouse the same enthusiasm as the referendum on Scotland did. That was a hugely important event. This is a hugely important event. The question will be asked, and the question will be in some of your minds, is it possible for Britain to remotely prosper economically outside the EU? How would it be if Britain left the single market of the European Union. But many people would answer that they would be fearful if we left the European Union, that it is a leap in the dark. Businessmen, I know, would be anxious, many of them, though some would have a different opinion. There are issues particularly relating to the services industry and financial services, which are an important part of the British economy. In the case of the financial services, it's often the case that offshore financial centres can do well. Britain is not in the euro, but it handles a huge amount of the transactions in euros. Britain, for many years, handled a huge proportion of the transactions in dollars in the world. We might find that were we outside the EU, there would be attempts by countries like France to enact measures that would ensure that the financial centre of Europe, which is London at present, moved to Frankfurt or Berlin. But to be honest, that is to some extent happening already. And there are plenty of examples of where Britain has lost out in proposals, where proposals have been made by other countries, frankly, in the name of their own national interest. Of course, in Bolton, in Lancashire, people are going to be more interested in other industries and more interested in manufacturing. What would their future be? What would their position be vis-à-vis the single market? US and Japanese firms exploit the single market just as much as EU firms do. Switzerland, outside the European Union, exports proportionately more than the UK does to the EU. The Swiss economy, despite the fact that they are not members of the European Union, is much more integrated into the European economy than ours is. And Switzerland, too, like Britain, has a very important financial services industry which seems to prosper within the European Union. Some people say, oh, we'll be excluded from all the regulations that are made in Brussels. I think this is somewhat exaggerated. There is a process by which Norway and Switzerland and other countries outside the EU are consulted about single market regulations. And in any case, not every firm in Britain is an exporter, and not every exporter is an exporter to the European Union. Removing the burden of much European regulation would be welcomed by many companies in Britain whose business is with the domestic market. There are arguments that the EU would arrest tariffs against us. Frankly, I find that unbelievable, considering that the European Union sells much more to us than we do to them. There's the argument that foreign investment would dry up unless foreign investors thought they had access to the single market. Well, they would have access to the single market. You don't have to be in Europe in order to sell in Europe, any more that the Taiwanese have to be in China in order to sell to China, or Japan needs to be in China to sell to China. I retain an open mind on the question of whether we should stay in a reformed EU or whether we should quit it. Frankly, I will make up my mind, like many people, when I see the terms and the details of the package that David Cameron negotiates, if he is given the opportunity to negotiate it. There are many deficiencies in the way the European Union works. It's bureaucratic, wasteful, I believe driven in its operations often not by a notion of good government, but about the idea of assuming more and more authority and power to itself. It's essential in making their decision that people look at the European Union not just as it is today, but where is it going? Where will it be in 20 years' time? Is it the case, as some people say, that the high water mark of federalism has passed and that's all out of date? Or is Europe trying to become a United States of Europe? To my mind, these are the important questions. They're questions about our own identity. They're questions about what sort of country we want to be. They're questions about accountability, about democracy. These issues are, to my mind, much more important than narrow questions of economics. It's not all about money, it's about democracy and accountability as well. And for that reason, 2017 could very well be a historic and momentous year. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the Q&A session, I just would like to mention a few points where I believe they are deserved to be mentioned. One of them is 2.5 years ago, I met Professor Holmes, the Vice Chancellor. I told him about the idea of the center, and it is truly because of his support and vision where we are today. So thank you so much for your help. It's wonderful. And the second point is I just would like to report to you that we have people coming to attend this lecture from as far as London in the south to as far as Dundee to the north, and many in between. So thank you very much for our visitors here. And thirdly, I thought it's a minor point, but it's worth to mention that for those who are not very much immersed in the British politics, to report to you that David Cameron and William Hague were the assistants of Norman Lamont. May I repeat? The assistants. So Norman Lamont. Lord Lamont has kindly agreed to take a Q&A, so please, if you have any questions, please, or comments, please raise it. And by the way, pro-European comments are highly welcome as well. So this is a balanced free speech platform. And one final thing, please, if you find me that there is a choice between a man or a woman, I will definitely tell to the woman as a father of 4 daughters. So please, please, could you identify yourself and
two questions to Lord Norman. One is, do you think that Britain will be better off leaving the EU politically and economically? And the second question is, what future you see of Islamic finance within the European Union?
Well, on the first question, I hoped I'd spent a fair amount of time. Obviously with no success. I outlined the fears that some people have. It's all about this question, I think, of the rules of the single market. Would they be imposed on us? Is that a great disadvantage? I don't fear there would be a great effect on inward investment long term. Businessmen might get nervous in the short term, but I think they would be wrong. I think they would eventually be proved to be wrong. I think the big question, which I, in a sense, didn't touch on, is really whether Britain would lose influence in the world. And I do concede that is quite a big question. I am critical of the European Union, the way it works, its bureaucracy, its insatiable appetite to say there is only a European answer to problems, even when there is plainly a national answer to problems. But I concede that there is a perception in the world that the European Union is an organization that matters, and will Britain actually be more effective outside than inside? That is a difficult question, which people will have to make up their minds in 2017 if there is a referendum. But I don't think I can add a huge amount to what I have already said. The future of Islamic finance in this country, Well, I think there is a large Muslim population that obviously wish to see more Islamic finance available. The British government wanted to issue debt that would qualify as Islamic finance. That took a long time in coming, but I don't see why Britain shouldn't have part of its borrowing requirement financed by instruments that are Sharia compliant. So I see a considerable future for the Islamic finance in this country. Can we have the microphone? I'm very deaf.
Yeah, thank you very much for your explanation. But EU was formed to bring stability and peace to Europe after the Second World War. So why Britain is planning to move out?
Why what?
Move out of the European Union. Are we taking the peace for granted?
Well, it's a good question, but I would question whether the fact that the European Union exists is why we haven't had another war in Europe. I would have hoped we might have learned quite a lot from the Second World War. It took a long time to rebuild Germany. Germany was rebuilt on democratic lines. Germany, in many ways, is an admirable democracy today. But I don't think there is really a likelihood of a war between the major countries in Europe. We all trade with each other. We would trade with each other whether the European Union existed or not. We all travel throughout Europe. We would travel throughout Europe whether the European Union existed or not. We intermarry. We know each other. Distance has died. People are much closer because of improved transport. Today's world in Europe is very, very different. And I think the idea that peace in Europe has been achieved by the European Union, I think, is somewhat overstated. The real reason we had peace in Europe, where there was a real threat, was the existence of NATO, which was formed in order to defend Europe. And so I don't think that if Britain decided to leave the European Union, that would be threatening the peace of Europe in no way.
Hi, my name is Josh.
As I mentioned earlier, when there is a man and a woman, we'll go for the woman. Soon, after her, if I may. Thank you. It is this fine lady.
I see a point about the euro. I'm actually Patricia, I'm studying here, but I'm from Poland. I do understand the point about the euro that is in tragic situation right now. Do you think that the policy is causing that? Because obviously countries in the Eurozone got their own, they want monetary policy, but because they've got their own fiscal policy, that's why the debts are, growing. Do you think that if this situation would, be sustained and everything will be fine, that all countries have the same fiscal policy as well, would you think that Britain could join them?
Well, I think the question is, if we had a fiscal union in Europe, let's say we had a Chancellor of the Exchequer for Europe, to whom is he accountable? Who chooses him? How are we going to have a common tax system throughout Europe? Supposing people in France want a higher rate, the government in France wants a higher rate of VAT. People in one country don't. I know everybody wants a lower rate of VAT, but let's just suppose different countries have different views. Supposing electors have different views about how taxation should be. Let's suppose we get a Labour government in Britain that want to introduce a mansion tax and higher taxes on the higher paid, and supposing we get a Conservative government in Poland who want to reduce taxes. How is this to be squeezed into some sort of common compromise? You have to leave some powers with national governments who are responsible in general elections to the voters. I don't just see how one can have some indirect democracy whereby we elect people but not choices. And we just say, go off and negotiate the best you can, and we'll forget about what the detail is. You know, it was because of this, that was one of the reasons we didn't want the euro in Britain. We argued you can't have the euro without fiscal policy throughout Europe, and fiscal policy throughout Europe is not compatible with national democracy. You know, voters want to vote. Should taxes go up or down? Should borrowing be cut? Should public expenditure be increased? You know, that's what the next general election in this country is going to be about. Now, supposing Miliband and Cameron just had to say, well, it'll depend upon what we can negotiate with Italy, France, Spain, Poland, etc. So I don't think that is the logic, as you rightly say, of the euro, but I think it is completely impractical. Of course, that's not what the Germans wanted. When the euro was set up, the Germans, you know, this is where the euro is so odd. The euro is a currency without a government. It's a currency without a country, and it's a currency without a fiscal policy. And you know, the Germans were just as much in opposition to a common fiscal policy as we were, but they took the view you could have this currency without a common tax system. I don't believe you can.
Please.
Sorry. You spoke a lot about the single market from a political standpoint. Well, there's been a few large companies that have mentioned that if we left the EU, they'd leave the UK. Do you think that that's got quite a large impact on some of the negative, negative impacts of living in the EU? And is there anything that we could do politically to encourage them to stay?
Well, you know, the people who say Britain will lose foreign investment if we left the European Union, and I have not come here to say we should leave. It may have seemed to Mohammed I was saying that, but I did not say we should leave the European Union, and I will genuinely not make any decision until I see what happens in 2017. But the people, you know, I just wanted to correct the conventional, I think, easily stated view that it's impossible for Britain to live. You know, I don't believe that it's impossible for us to survive outside the European Union. But the people who say it is impossible, some of the Japanese motor companies, some of the American investors, these are the people who said, if you don't join the euro, we'll all decamp. I mean, all the Japanese companies, Nissan, Toyota, the lot of them, they said, if Britain doesn't join the euro, we're off. None of them left at all. You know, they had this, when I think about businessmen in the single market, it reminds me of the 1970s when we used to have counter-inflation policy that was enforced by law, and we had laws that said you can only increase the price of bread by 2.5%, or the price of television rentals, or the price of a kettle by 2.5%. We had laws controlling inflation. And many businessmen said, oh, when you remove these controls, inflation will go through the roof. I think sometimes businessmen overstate the effect of politics, overstate the effect of laws. And the fact that someone sells socks or motor car components to Europe isn't because of some law, it's because there's a customer there. It's nothing to do with politics. And you know, there will be willing buyers and willing sellers, just as Switzerland sells into the European Union without being a member of the European Union.
Please, the question before the last.
I'm Brian Idden, and I've got form in politics, as some of you will know. Norman, can you see if Syriza survives in government in Greece, Greece being forced out of the European Union, and if it is, will the southern dominoes begin to topple?
You couldn't get me another glass of water, could you? Well, that's a very good question. Syriza are beginning to, well, not beginning. Syriza said during the election that they did not want to leave the euro. I'll give away a secret, actually. The finance minister of Syriza is actually a friend of mine. You may believe I've got many Marxist friends, but I've got one or two in different countries, and I've been receiving the odd message. And I know that the view of a lot of people in Syriza was we should never have joined the euro, but it's impossible to get out of it. And I have a lot of sympathy with that analysis. I've always said that the euro is a little bit like a lobster pot. The lobster can crawl into it, but it's very difficult for him to turn around and get out of the pot. Once he's in, it's very, very difficult. And Syriza have said, as indeed Greek opinion is, in favour of staying in the euro. I tried to explain why I thought that was. It's all to do with modernity and putting fascism behind them. So they are trying to stay in the euro. They want to have a lot of debt forgiveness. They want to call a conference of creditors, and they want to have their debt renegotiated. Of course, the northern countries, Germany, Finland, Holland, all their ministers have expressed great discomfort with this idea, and they are in a difficult position. I mean, Syriza's in a difficult position, but so are the politicians of Finland and Germany, because public opinion in Finland, Holland, and Germany will be saying, why should we pay for the losses and the overspending in Greece? And this is a terrible dilemma for Mrs. Merkel. I'm sure she wants the euro to survive, but she is being threatened increasingly by the rise of Neue Deutschland, but not just the rise of Neue Deutschland, many German newspapers and German public opinion saying, you know, you must stick to the rules. An agreement is an agreement. I think a compromise is actually possible, and one can see how it could be done. It would be done not by a debt write-off, but by perhaps lowering the interest rate on some of the loans that have been made to Greece and lengthening the maturity of the loan. Now that would be a compromise which could reduce the debt to GDP ratio of Greece by maybe 8-10 percentage points, and some people have put forward calculations indicating ways in which it could be done further. The problem is that there is a huge risk of a miscalculation or a misstatement on either side, and so you could see a position where Greece was moving towards the exit. The Germans have recently stated that they believe the Eurozone is sufficiently strong to withstand a Grexit. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that that is their truthful attitude. I believe that if Greece did leave the euro, it would inevitably lead to doubts about the soundness of Spanish, Italian, Portuguese debtors as well. And I think also the success of Syriza will lead other political parties in those countries to make very similar demands. So it's interesting, financial markets have bought the German government's statements at face value, and they are saying there's no danger. One, they don't believe Greece will leave, and two, that it won't be catastrophic if they do. But I think both those assumptions cannot be guaranteed, and I think this will be a very rocky few weeks. In March, a large repayment of Greek debt is due, and a further large repayment of Greek debt is due in July. I think a lot of people are hoping that Mr. Tsipras will ask for a 6-month continuation of the present arrangements, which is not what he said he will do. He's totally against them. But that if he has a 6-month extension, that at least gives him a breathing point at which both sides can consider their positions. But I think this is a situation fraught with considerable danger.
The final question, please.
Thank you. I'm Iqbal Ajalgo from the Business School. Lord Lamont, how do you think our British economy will be affected by the trillions that will be injected by the quantitative easing in Europe?
Well, I think quantitative easing, in general, puts a floor under financial markets. It raises equity prices. It lowers interest rates in bond markets, puts up share prices. It's rather good for the better off. The question is, what does it actually do for the economy of Europe, or for that matter of the United States and Britain? I think it was right to have QE in Britain in 2007, 2008, because there was a real danger of a meltdown of asset prices. But I'm sceptical that either in the United States or Britain, QE had any real effect on the growth of the economy. But that is a point that it is impossible to prove either way. I suspect that in Europe, the effect of quantitative easing will be very marginal. Actually, prior to this Greek crisis arising, I thought it was possible that Europe was not at a big turning point, but a little turning point, because the euro was already weakening, even before the quantitative easing. Quantitative easing will weaken it further. Because of that, consumer confidence had risen a bit in the Eurozone, and most importantly of all, you had this massive drop in oil prices, which is like a gigantic tax cut for the Eurozone. So if we put the Greek crisis to one side and we manage to survive all that, it's quite possible that Mr. Draghi may have caught the tide and the Eurozone economy will be improving, and he'll get the credit for something that would have happened anyway.
Thank you very much. Will you allow me to invite Professor Hall, the Vice Chancellor, for his closing remarks, please?
Well, my Lord, you have done it again, of course. Brought very interesting topics to the forefront of our mind. And of course, as a sort of escapee economist from my early career, I find this particularly interesting, particularly the paradox of the whole notion of Islamic finance sitting alongside primarily the control of a money supply by a change in interest rates. Because, of course, Sharia law doesn't necessarily agree with interest rates. And so one gets the whole notion of where would Islamic finance sit in this context of exchange rate equalisation. I'm thankful to you for your input. I think it demonstrates more than anything else that there is no substitute for experience. And to listen to someone with the type and level and range of experience that you've had, sir, is indeed a pleasure for us all. It's in a way what this university is about as it moves forward. And what is it we're about as we move forward as a university? We're about, of course, a continuous improvement in the staff and the student experience. The adding of additional knowledge and expertise to our already rich diversity as one of the most diverse and culturally inclusive institutions in the country. And to have a former Chancellor Exchequer and a former First Secretary of the Treasury here to talk with us adds to that richness and debate. And it's great that despite all odds, we were both in London this morning very early, despite all odds with transport, and there were some difficulties with transport, that the visiting party, particularly Lord Lamont and Lady Morris, have made it here. And I'm particularly grateful for that. Otherwise, you may have had to listen to a very second-rate economist, me, on this particular topic. So you wouldn't believe how grateful I am that you made it. And probably even more grateful they would have been. Okay, so what do I want to say? Excellence is at the heart of what a university does. As we move forward with confidence in this university over the next 5 years, you will see massive investment in our facilities in science and technology and in engineering, but also in a wide range of subjects here that are dear to the heart, from the arts through the psychologies through to the health and the sports sciences. This is indeed a rich university in all senses in terms of its ability to invest in its future and have confidence in its students and its staff, but moreover in its town. And in that sense, we move forward as a town and gown together. And yet again, the Mayor of Bolton is here representing the civic head of the town, the civic authorities of the town. And indeed, you are always very welcome in this university, sir, as our first citizen. So, little more for me to say, other than that these type of lectures, these type of inputs of this quality are part of what I think we're calling in Bolton at the minute a willful attempt at institution building at world-class level. And of course, when it comes to political life and to holding the office of Chancellor Exchequer, as our speaker has done, it is at a world-class level. It's a world stage upon which Norman Lamont, as he was then, operated. And so you do us great privilege today being here, and I thank you on behalf of the university for that. Of course, this wouldn't be possible because these things just don't happen. It wouldn't be possible without the good offices, of course, of our founding Chancellor, Lady Morris, who, through her work at the House of Lords as a working peer, on a regular basis is enabled to bring people of Norman's calibre to us. And I do recognise more than anything else we wouldn't be here today without Lady Morris. But of course, as Lady Morris always, you can see her the puppeteer pulling the strings. And he's pointing out, of course, that actually it's really Professor Mohammed Abdul Haq that's behind all this. And of course, we wouldn't have, despite Mohammed's earlier comments about me, we wouldn't have a Centre for Islamic Finance. We wouldn't have the expertise and knowledge in the banking sector that Mohammed brings without Mohammed Abdul Haq. And he has brought a lot to this university, both internationally and domestically, reputationally, and indeed in quality terms in the work that he does. And so the last word does absolutely go to my thanks to Professor Abdul Haq for the work at the Centre for Islamic Finance, and of course to all our visitors who've spent the evening with us. You are, of course, always very welcome. But if you join with me in thanking Norman Lamont and Professor Abdul Haq, please.